Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Back to Class Talk. To those of you who are visiting Hanover for homecoming weekend, welcome. My name is Danielle Sparks, and I am the Assistant Director of Lifelong Learning. I work with the team in Alumni Relations that creates lifelong educational programs for alumni, parents, and friends of the college. Our office sponsors educational opportunities here in Hanover, across the country, and around the world. If you're interested in learning more about what we do, you can pick up information at the table out front or check out our alumni website. I also wanted to show you all, we have this beautiful new brochure for all of our alumni, someone's already picked it up, for our alumni trips in 2015. So make sure to pick that up on your way out. Without further ado, let me tell you a bit about this afternoon's speaker. Brendan Nyhan is an assistant professor in the Department of Government. His research, which focuses on political scandal and misperceptions about politics and healthcare, has been published in journals, including the American Journal of Political Science, British Journal of Political Science, Medical Care, and Pediatrics. Professor Nyhan is a contributor to The Upshot at the New York Times and previously served as a media critic for Columbia Journalism Review. He received his PhD from the Department of Political Science at Duke University in 2008 and served as the Robert Wood Johnson Scholar in Health Policy Research at the University of Michigan from 2009 to 2011, before joining us here at Dartmouth College. Please join me in welcoming Professor Brendan Nyhan.
Make sure I'm unmuted. Thanks very much, everyone, for coming out today on this beautiful fall day in New England. Welcome back if you're coming back to us from wherever you have been. So I'm going to talk to you today. We have about an hour, so I'm going to try to talk to you for about 35 minutes. I want to leave time for your questions, okay? So please be ready with those when we get to the end, because, you know, like in the spirit of lifelong learning, we'd like to have you involved in this conversation too, okay? So what I'm going to be talking to you about today is misinformation about healthcare, but we're going to use that as a context to think more generally about how people make sense of the world and the ways in which sometimes people can come to hold beliefs that aren't accurate, okay? So the problem that I'm interested in is this one. Why do people believe, there are two case studies here, why do people believe things that aren't true? Okay, so here on the left, we have a poster from the death panels debate, if you remember that, of people who believe that the Affordable Care Act would create a government body that would withhold medical care from people and cause, you know, grandma to die, okay? Here on the right, we have a poster saying that vaccines are poisoning our children, okay? So these are both claims that are inconsistent with the best available evidence. These are unsupported claims, and yet people believe them. And we've thrown factual information at people to try to counter claims like this for a long time. And it doesn't seem to work. So why is that? Okay? That's the question that I want to engage with today and hopefully convince you that just giving people the facts isn't always the correct answer. It's not always the most effective response to misperceptions. And in some cases, it can make the problem worse. So we need to think more carefully about what we do to try to counter mistaken beliefs of whatever kind. Okay? And again, we're going to talk about this in the context of healthcare, but I hope you'll see what sorts of applications this might have in other domains. And let me just say, I'm not going to talk specifically about Ebola and then talk now, but I did write about that this week, and I'd be happy to talk about that in the Q&A if people are interested. Okay, so the problem is we tend to like to pretend we live in this world. Okay? So, of course, when you put it like that, no one would actually say that's what they believe. But if you think about it, education, health, journalism, all sorts of different fields proceed as if this is how people make sense of the world. They're waiting for the facts, and if we could just get them to them, they would come to understand, right? They would update their beliefs and say, oh, okay, I'm mistaken. Maybe I've come to the wrong view, but now I've learned this new information, and I have the correct view, right? So we'd like that to be the case, but it often isn't, right? Instead, the world often looks more like this, right? And especially when it comes to controversial or polarizing issues that have to do with fundamental aspects of people's identities, whether it's race or religion or politics, things that are going to be hard for people to admit they're wrong about, okay, that's going to be threatening to them potentially to concede that their side might not be right or that they've come to some mistaken belief. Okay? And when it comes to those sorts of controversial identity-relevant issues, we may get a response more like this. And what I hope to convince you of is that this sort of response isn't just I'm not hearing it, but I may actually double down on that belief that you're trying to tell me is wrong. Okay? And that's what I think we should be most worried about. So what I hope to convince you of is first a story of why people are often holding these false or unsupported beliefs about controversial issues. Second, why corrective information isn't always the best response and in some cases can be counterproductive. And third, what can I teach us about health? Okay? And specifically vaccines. So we're going to first start by talking about politics, then we're going to talk about healthcare politics, and finally we're going to get to the issues of vaccines. And what I hope to convince you of is that there's a thread running through that of how people are rejecting unwelcome information and how a controversial issue, even like vaccines, which seems like it's maybe one step away from partisan politics, people may be responding in the same way when we try to give them that information that they wouldn't like to hear. Okay, so let me just introduce a couple of distinctions here that might be helpful. The first point I want to make is that people don't know lots of things, right? So if we give people a survey, right, and we've done this in social science for decades, and we say, do you know who the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is? Or how many votes does it take to override a veto in Congress? Or what is the Federal Reserve? Right? People don't know the answers to those questions, right? By and large, right? You're all now thinking, yeah, how many votes does it take for a veto, right? Okay, those are hard questions, right? But people don't tend to know the answers to those, okay? But the claim I would make to you is that in many cases, you're aware you don't know the correct answers to those, okay? Those are kind of, to a lot of people, pointless trivia, okay? That's not relevant to their lives. I think it's perfectly understandable. The distinction that's crucial here, though, and one that we haven't appreciated until recently, is the distinction between being misinformed and being uninformed, okay? People who are uninformed don't know anything, but they may be well aware they don't know anything, okay, about this particular issue or question we're asking about, on the one hand. People who are misinformed may confidently believe that incorrect claim, that unsupported claim, okay? That distinction turns out to be crucial, okay? Because people who are misinformed may be much more likely to reject that information telling them that their belief isn't correct, okay? So, and that misinformation is often also going to be much more closely linked to aspects, like I described to you, of your identity, particularly in the context of American politics, your partisanship or ideology, okay? And because misperceptions are tied to those fundamental aspects of your identity and your belief system, right, they can be worse. They can be harder to counter, and the misperceptions that people have can really stick, as we'll see. Okay, so there's a great quote that I like that's often misattributed to Mark Twain, which I think is very appropriate for this topic. It's actually by this guy who turns out to be kind of the other Mark Twain of the 19th century named Josh Billings. Okay, but I really like this quote. It's better to know less than to know so much that ain't so. Okay, and what he's really saying here, I hope you can see, is it's better to be uninformed than to be misinformed. Okay, so there's a truth there that was captured a long time ago, but we're only starting to understand that distinction in social science. Okay, so how big a problem are misperceptions? So I'm going to start in the domain of politics. I'm a political scientist, so this is where I'm most comfortable. And just to show you how pervasive misperceptions can be, I'm going to show you data on two different misperceptions that are closely linked to people's partisan identities. Okay? One, the claim that President Obama wasn't born in the United States, that's more prevalent among Republicans. And the other, the claim that 9/11 was a conspiracy or an inside job, that was more prevalent among Democrats during the Bush administration. Okay? And remember, I told you that misperceptions are often closely linked to aspects of people's identity. And so what you can see is, okay, there's a steep partisan gradient to each of these beliefs, right? So Democrats believe the 9/11 inside job theory the most, and it declines as we move to Republicans, right? And vice versa for the claim that President Obama wasn't born in this country, okay? So these are intensely partisan sorts of beliefs that people have, and they're very prevalent, okay? More than 40% of Democrats said the Bush administration either aided or allowed the 9/11 attacks in the 2006 poll, okay, that we're looking at here. More than 40% of Republicans said President Obama wasn't born in this country in the 2010 poll. This is a lot of people. We're talking about millions and millions and millions of people here. Okay? So I want to convince you first just of the magnitude of these things. Okay? So these aren't fringe things we're talking about, tiny percentages of the population. These can be quite dramatic. Okay. The second point I want to make. Remember, I told you that misperceptions are more likely to be confidently held. Let me give you some evidence for that. Okay? So those of you who remember the Clinton healthcare debate of 93, 94, the misperception about that plan that was most common, most frequently disseminated, was that you would lose your choice of doctor, even if you paid out of pocket. Okay? That claim was false. Okay? But it played a very significant role in the debate over that bill. Some leading Republicans credit with helping to kill the Clinton healthcare plan. Okay? So that's the misperception we're looking at here. On the left, survey evidence about that from 1993. Okay? On the right here, we're looking at survey evidence about the death panels myth, which was the most prevalent myth about President Obama's healthcare plan in 2009. Okay? And in these plots here, we're looking at the predicted probabilities, okay, on the y-axis that people would believe in that misperception. So the higher it is, the more people believe in that misperception. Okay? So what I want to draw your attention to is what happens as you go from low to high in each of these graphs on people's perceived knowledge of the plan. So both of these polls ask people, how much do you know about the plan? Okay? And they ask them so subjectively. So this is not an objective measure, right? This is how much do you think you know about the plan? Okay? And among the group that was predisposed to believe in the misperception, which in this case was Republicans, those who said they knew more were more likely to be misinformed, okay, in both cases. Okay? I want to make sure you heard that right. The people who thought they knew more knew less, okay, in the group that's most likely to be misinformed. So there's a real threat here. We can lie to ourselves very effectively, okay? All right. And this extends into domain of health. Now, there's a lot of text up here. I don't want you to stare over my shoulder reading it, so let me stand in front of it. Okay? This is a recent publication by some political scientists at the University of Chicago showing how many Americans believe in various sorts of medical conspiracy theories. Okay, so these are more sort of pure health misperceptions. The FDA is holding back natural cures to cancer. The CIA created HIV. There's a whole series of these. Okay? And substantial percentages of Americans are either agree with these, right? So, somewhere between 12 and 37%, right? Or they're not sure, neither agree nor disagree. Who knows? Okay? So, again, these are quite substantial in the domain of health as well as in politics. Okay. So, why do these misperceptions stick? The reason, I think, is because it's so threatening to us to admit that we're wrong. Okay? No one likes to be told that they're wrong. I don't like it, and you don't like it, okay? So when we give people corrective information, that can be very threatening. It's discordant with your current beliefs, and it might have implications you're not comfortable with about your belief system, the politicians you like and don't like, and so forth, okay? This is what we call, in political science and psychology, motivated reasoning. Okay? There's something called a disconfirmation bias. If I tell you you're wrong, you're going to be more skeptical of that information, okay? If I tell you you're right, you think that is great, right? You're not skeptical enough of when someone tells you that you're right and when someone tells you you're wrong, right? We're very, very skeptical of that, okay? And that's going to apply in the factual domain to helping us understand why people are often rejecting unwelcome corrective information, okay? So when it comes to opinion, you might say, it's perfectly natural, right? I'm not going to change my views based on one piece of information, okay? But when it comes to facts, we'd like people to update their beliefs, right? We'd like people to be able to admit that they're wrong. But psychologically, that can be a difficult thing. And I'm going to show you some evidence of just how hard that might be, okay? So one thing you might want to worry about is, well, maybe people aren't hearing they're wrong. So let's take a really high-profile example. The claim that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction before the U.S. invasion in 2003. Okay? This was a widely publicized claim. You basically couldn't avoid it. Okay? Before the U.S. invasion, of course, it was being made by both Democrats and Republicans. That was something of an elite consensus, not complete. There were people who were dissenting from that view. But I think it's fair to say there was a strong elite consensus that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction before the invasion. People thought that before we went in, okay? So it's not surprising that at the time of the invasion, most Americans thought Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. That's what they were told, okay? But what happens when we get in there and we don't find them? Okay? That is an incredibly salient claim, if you remember, right? The news about the lack of weapons of mass destruction was hard to avoid, right? We were there, we kept looking and looking and looking and not finding them, okay? So if people are updating their views, the percentage of Americans who believe that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction should be plummeting to zero here, right? As people find out that actually they didn't find them, right? I just want to underscore the level of consensus here, right? So the Dwelfer report was the official report put out by the Bush administration that Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction or an active ongoing weapons of mass destruction program, okay? So this was released in this period, okay, by the Bush administration, okay? So the evidence is overwhelming, and yet the percentage of Americans who believe Iraq had weapons of mass destruction flattens out around 40%. Now, the polling gets pretty sparse after 2006, but my colleague Ben Valentino in the government department polled it again in 2012 and found it was still around 40%. Okay? So these things can stick. Okay. So you might be saying, well, this is because people aren't very smart or they don't know that much, right? That's a response I get all the time when I talk about this. So I want to convince you that the story is more complicated, and I think more interesting. Okay? So a misperception you may remember is the claim by former General Electric CEO Jack Welch that the Obama administration was manipulating the unemployment statistics before the 2012 election. So the unemployment statistics that came out in early October, right before the election, were just under 8%. A little bit lower than analysts expected. And Jack Welch wrote on Twitter that the Chicago guys were messing with the numbers. Okay? And there's no evidence to say that was the case. Democratic and Republican economists said there's absolutely no evidence of this. No evidence has since emerged of this. It's a completely unsupported claim. Okay? But it got a lot of publicity. So who believed this claim? Okay? So I did a poll in 2012, and what we're looking at here, remember before we talked about subjective knowledge, what people think they knew. So here now I have an objective measure of how much you know. I ask people trivia questions about politics to see who knows more and less about politics, okay? For Democrats, who are the ones who are predisposed to disbelieve in this claim, the Democrats who knew objectively more about politics were less likely to believe in the claim, right? These are moving down as you move from low to medium to high knowledge, okay? But for Republicans, which again is a group that's going to be predisposed to believe in this claim, they don't like the Obama administration. As they go from low to medium to high knowledge, they believe in it more. More, not less. Okay, why? Well, one interpretation is they think that President Obama might do something like this, and because they're more knowledgeable, they're more likely to have received that information in the first place and better able to align their general political views with the beliefs they hold. Okay? But I just want to complicate that intuition that people sometimes have that this is just about people not being educated or knowledgeable. In some cases, knowledge makes us better able to hold the views we'd like to hold. Okay? You're better able, if you're more politically sophisticated, to come to some rationalization of why that might be true. Okay? Or to find that piece of information that's going to validate your pre-existing belief. Okay. So what's going on? Okay. What I think is happening is people are resisting unwelcome information through this process that I described to you. We call it defensive counter-arguing. Right? So I tell you you're wrong, and you say, no, I'm not wrong, and you think of reasons why. Okay? And in the process of thinking of those reasons, in some cases, you can actually come to convince yourself even more strongly in that claim than you would have if I hadn't challenged you in the first place. Okay? And this process, sometimes, not always, can be worse among more sophisticated people. Okay. So I'm going to show you results from 3 studies investigating this problem. First in the political domain, then looking at healthcare politics, and then finally looking at vaccines. Okay, and these are from 3 studies. The citation's up here. I'd be happy to email them to people if you like to see them. Okay, so the first study was an experiment where subjects read mock news articles. Okay, and what we did was experimentally manipulated whether people saw corrective information or not in the context of this article. Okay? And the reason we did that is we wanted to be sure we were isolating the effect of seeing that corrective information on people's beliefs that they expressed afterwards. Okay? And we asked about a range of different issues. I'm going to show you one example result. These were done in 2005 and 2006. Okay? So this is an example of what the stimulus would look like. Okay? A claim that was frequently made during the Bush administration that wasn't correct is that his tax cuts increased government revenue. That's a claim that is inconsistent with the beliefs of virtually every economist, including Bush's own economists, okay, who repeatedly expressed their disagreement with this claim. Okay? So there's a quote by President Bush, real quote, suggesting that the tax cuts had increased revenues to the Treasury. Okay? And then there's corrective information saying, actually, revenues are going down, not up. Okay? And then we ask people, do you agree or disagree that President Bush's tax cuts have increased government revenue, which is the misperception we're interested in? So what happens if people get this corrective information? Okay? Well, among liberals, who are the group who we don't expect to want to believe that President Bush's tax cuts are doing anything good, well, their beliefs in this go down a little bit. But they didn't believe it very much to begin with. Okay? The problem is, for conservatives, who are a group we'd expect to want to like this, the belief essentially doubles. Okay? This is something we call a backfire effect. So we've provoked people into believing this claim. Okay? And we think it stimulated people to go through that arguing process of why President Bush's tax cuts might have increased government revenue after all. Okay? By challenging people, we've made them more likely to express the misperception we're trying to counter. Okay? So it's an incredibly perverse and troubling sort of finding. Okay? And we've been working since then on how we can do better. I'd be happy to talk about that in the Q&A, but I want to give you a couple more results just to show you how these sorts of problems can work in a couple of different areas. Okay, this is Sarah Palin's Facebook post that launched the death panel myth in 2009. Okay? The America I know and love is not one in which my parents or baby with Down syndrome will have to stand in front of Obama's death panel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so this was made in August of 2009. Within a month, more than 80% of Americans claimed to have heard of it. It sparked a huge controversy, very widely publicized, and it's still echoing in the debate over end-of-life care. Okay, so very significant claim, and actually there were end-of-life provisions that were removed from the bill specifically because of the controversy that this set off. Okay? So what we wanted to see was, well, what would happen if we corrected that? So the media were unusually aggressive in saying that this claim was false. So here's an example from the New York Times, false death panel rumor, the stubborn yet false rumor. So they're very directly saying this isn't true. So again, we'd like to see what happens when the media say this isn't correct. Okay? So here we're going to be looking at how people react to this. I'm going to add two variants to what we looked at before. The first one, which is important, so you've got to think about where Sarah Palin was at the time we did this, which was 2011. Okay? She had become very controversial even within the Republican Party. Okay? So it turned out there was significant heterogeneity in how much Republicans wanted to believe her or listen to her by this point. So what we're going to be using instead of party ID is how people feel about Sarah Palin on something called a feeling thermometer. Okay? Where you rate how warmly or coldly you feel towards a certain public figure. Okay? And the second is we're going to be differentiating people based on their objective political knowledge, like I described to you earlier. Okay? Here's the stimulus article, very similar to what you saw before. There's the claim by Sarah Palin, okay? And then there's the corrective information, which we experimentally manipulate whether people see it or not. Okay? However, nonpartisan healthcare experts have concluded that Palin is wrong, so on and so on. Okay? So what happens when people get that information? Okay? I'm going to show you that the result is going to vary based on how much people know about politics. Okay? So I'm going to walk you through this graph and help you understand what it means. Okay? So on the x-axis here is the feeling thermometer. From 0, I feel very coldly towards this person, to 100, I love her like my mother. Okay? And as you go up here, right, you're feeling more warm towards Sarah Palin. Okay? On the y-axis is the predicted probability of believing in the death panel myth. Okay? All right. So our baseline is this solid line here. That's the predicted probability of believing this claim if you don't get the corrective information. And what you can see, not surprisingly, is it's upward sloping, right? So the more you like Sarah Palin, the more likely you are to believe that claim. No surprise. Okay? What happens, though, when we give you that corrective information? Well, in the left panel here, for folks with low political knowledge, what you see is the predicted probability of believing that claim is going down, right? You see how this line is shifted, the dashed line is shifted downward from the solid line, okay? The shaded area represents where that's a statistically significant difference. So the correction is working. For those folks who feel neutrally towards Palin to warmly towards Palin, who have low political knowledge, it's working. They're less likely to agree that death panels are real. Okay? So far, so good, right? That's a more encouraging finding than what I showed you before. But when we get to the high knowledge folks, it gets a little trickier. Okay? So there's a region of this plot down here where you're seeing a similar effect of the correction reducing the likelihood people will believe in the death panel myth. But those are for people who can't stand Sarah Palin. Okay? And they're very unlikely to believe in it anyway, right? This is a tiny reduction, very close to zero. Okay? What's more troubling is this group who really like Sarah Palin and know a lot about politics. And it turns out for that group, we're seeing, again, a backfire effect. Okay? They're more likely to believe in that death panel myth when they get the correction rather than less. Okay? And that's why the dashed line there is higher than the solid line. Okay? So this is a case where people with high political knowledge may be better able to resist that unwelcome information. They may be able to think, well, why is that true? I remember I read that article, I heard that thing, and come up with reasons to justify their belief. And the process of doing that, if they're good enough at doing that, they can convince themselves of it even more than they would have had they not seen that correction in the first place. Okay? So, last, but certainly not least, is vaccines. Okay? This may seem like a big leap from politics, but I want to convince you that it's not. Those of you who have children either have recently experienced or probably remember how controversial an issue vaccines can be. Very emotional, identity-related issue. Okay? Just like politics. People have very strong views about vaccines. It's one of those topics you don't talk about with other parents, I can say from personal experience, unless you get into a very awkward and uncomfortable situation. And it has very significant misperceptions, just like politics. So let me just point out two here. This is from a survey conducted by my co-author on this study, Gary Freed, and his colleagues. 54% of parents are concerned about serious adverse effects of vaccines, even though they're incredibly rare. Okay? And 25% of parents think some vaccines cause autism in healthy children. Okay? This is a myth that was created by a discredited article published in the British medical journal The Lancet in 1998. It was so fraudulent that the author has been stripped of his medical license. It has been retracted. It's one of the great blemishes on the history of scientific medical publishing and has rippled through the medical world for years since then. Okay? Numerous studies since then have been conducted that show no evidence that vaccines cause autism. Okay? But it hasn't worked, right? This myth is still out there. So why? Right? And I submit to you that we're encountering that same problem. Okay? And I'm going to show you some evidence for why telling people the scientific evidence shows no support for the autism myth is ineffective and can actually be counterproductive. Okay? And I should say, by the way, let me just give you one brief overview of the situation in the United States. So the United States national vaccine rates are still quite good for childhood vaccines. In the UK, after that article came out, MMR vaccination rates dipped to dangerous levels. So there's something called a herd immunity threshold. You want to have a certain percentage of the population vaccinated. That helps protect everyone because measles is explosively contagious. Okay? Ebola, the average patient infects 2 other people. Measles, it's 18. 18. If I had measles right now, pow, you're all exposed. Right? Really, it's that explosive. Okay? It's an incredibly contagious disease. Okay? So it's very important to have these high population immunization levels to prevent those sorts of outbreaks because it's so explosive. Okay? So the United States hasn't had the dip that's happened in the UK, but people in the public health world are concerned these sorts of misperceptions are contributing to what's called selective non-receipt, which is when parents are selectively opting out of or delaying childhood vaccines that have been recommended according to the standard schedule. Okay? And those rates, again, are not at dangerous levels yet at the national level, but in certain communities and schools they are. And if your child goes to that school, they're at risk, right? Even if the larger population levels are higher, okay? So the public health stakes in this are very, very real. Okay, so this is a study we did in 2011. Okay? It's a nationally representative survey of parents with children 17 or younger at home. Okay? So these are parents who do have children at home. Some of them may be past the age where they'd be choosing whether or not to get MMR, so we're going to be asking them about what they would do if they had another child. Okay? And we tested a bunch of different approaches to promoting vaccination in this study. I'm just going to focus on that corrective information because that's what we've been talking about today. But I'd be happy to talk about the other messages in the Q&A if people are interested. Okay? And again, we're going to be experimentally testing what happens when people see that corrective information. And the outcome measures we're going to be looking at are first, do they believe in the vaccine autism myth? Okay? Just like the studies we've been talking about so far. But second, and more importantly from the perspective of public health, would they vaccinate a future child? Because the decision of whether or not to vaccinate is the bottom line in this area. Okay? And that's the one that has the most significant public health consequences. So this is what the corrective information looks like. Don't try to read it, or we'll be here for a while. But this is the real text from the CDC website. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has a page about vaccines and autism that basically recounts the scientific evidence that this claim is a myth. Okay? And we simply took that text and slightly adapted it to fit on the computer screen. We're giving them exactly what they would get from the nation's leading health agency. Okay? So if you Googled CDC vaccines autism, you should come to this page and see this information. So what effect does that have? And the reason we did that, I want to say, is because we didn't want anyone to say, well, you did it the wrong way. We wanted to say, well, is what we're doing working? Okay? And the best way we could think of to do that was to actually use what they're using. Okay? So that's what this is. Okay? And when you read it, you'll probably be going, wow, that's pretty technical and clunky. Yes. Yes. Would I write it this way? No. But this is their material, so we're testing that. Okay? And again, just to make clear, this is the throwing facts and science and evidence at people approach, right? Many studies have found this. Look, a 2008 study in the Public Library of Science, intestinal tissue of autistic children, blah, 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 right? So it's getting pretty deep into the weeds, but just throwing that science at people. Okay, so what happens if people see this? So first we're going to look at those belief measures. Did parents become more or less likely to believe that vaccines cause autism or have other serious side effects if they got that corrective information? Okay, so we're comparing here to a control condition that didn't see that information. Okay, so we're going to be focusing on the comparison between this control condition and this correction condition highlighted in red. The others are those other messages I talked about that we could talk about in the Q&A if you're interested. Okay, so do vaccines cause autism? If they get the correction, that belief significantly decreases. This is a predicted probability they would strongly agree that vaccines cause autism. Okay, that's down in the correction condition. So it's working, right? So this is good news. Okay, you're telling people the evidence says that vaccines don't cause autism, and they're less likely to believe that. Okay, there's no statistically significant effect on their beliefs about MMR side effects more generally. Okay, but there's no evidence in either case of a backfire, and it's working for the autism myth. So far, so good, right? Okay. The more troubling result is when we get to, would you vaccinate a future child? Okay. And remember I talked to you about how people's pre-existing beliefs play a key role in how they react to new information. So what we're going to be looking at here is a measure of how people feel about vaccines based on a previous survey wave we administered about 2 weeks beforehand, where we asked them a battery of questions about how they feel about vaccines. Okay? And what we're going to do, for the sake of simplicity of presentation here, is look at 3 different groups. We're going to divide those into terciles. Folks who are the least pro-vaccine, folks who are in the middle, and folks who are the most pro-vaccine. Okay? So that's what we're seeing here as you go from left to right. the third of the sample that's the least pro-vaccine, somewhat favorable, and most favorable towards vaccines, okay? The key result here is this one, okay? And I'm going to zoom in on it so you can see it in one moment, but I just want to first orient you. There's no statistically significant difference between any of the conditions in people's likelihood to vaccinate a child in the future among those folks in the top 2/3 of the sample in terms of how pro-vaccine they are, okay? Those folks overwhelmingly say they would vaccinate a future child. Messages don't seem to change that, okay? So there's a strong consensus in this group to vaccinate, and the messages aren't affecting it either way. Okay? But from a public health perspective, remember I told you we need to maintain that herd immunity level. So it's this group that is of the most public health concern. Okay? Most of these folks are still vaccinating now. That's how we're keeping vaccination rates above 90%. But there are lots of what healthcare providers call vaccine hesitant parents. Those parents who have lots of questions and concerns and waver. Okay? Those are the parents who matter from a public health perspective, and they're in this group. Okay? Not just those who are already foregoing vaccination, but those who might. Okay? And that's the question that's most relevant, is how do you speak to those parents most effectively? So let's zoom in on that group. Okay? Among this group, you see that first, their intention to vaccinate is not as strong. So the predicted probability that they're very likely to vaccinate a future child with the MMR vaccine is only about 70% in the control condition versus 90+% in those other two groups. Okay? That drops dramatically when they get that corrective information, more than 20 percentage points. Okay? So this is an incredibly discouraging result. Okay? And it's a little bit different than the ones we saw before, so I just want to give you what we think is going on. Okay? But I'd be happy to talk about it in the Q&A. If I had to explain this to you, the argument I would make is people in the who are conflicted about vaccines aren't necessarily invested in the autism myth as such. They have a series of concerns or intuitions about vaccines, and when they're told the autism myth isn't true, they seem to accept that information. Remember, we saw that went down, but they appear to be doubling down instead on anti-vaccine views or concerns they might have. Okay? And again, in the process of thinking about those, they may come to feel more hesitant about vaccinating than they otherwise would have. Okay? So even in challenging that autism myth, which some people think is key to promoting vaccination, you may be instead provoking people to think more about why they have concerns about vaccines in the first place. Okay? I should say, when I started this research, I thought people had done all this already. I kept waiting to find the article where we were testing the messages we use about vaccines. We don't. As a rule, we don't. Okay? The drugs you use have to pass rigorous clinical testing to be used. Okay? The messages we use in health are hardly tested at all, as far as I can tell. Okay? So the message of this is we need to test more, not just assume that throwing facts at people work. Now, I'm not saying, and I want to be really clear about this, you shouldn't try to debunk the myth. We should. And I'm not saying that information, that corrections are never effective. And I want to point in particular to who's probably the most likely messenger, or most effective messenger, I should say. Healthcare providers. Okay? When you ask parents, who do you trust most when it comes to getting information about vaccines for your child, they overwhelmingly say the children's doctor. Overwhelmingly. Okay, not Jenny McCarthy, not whoever else you might think of, their children's doctor. Okay, so the pediatricians, general practitioners play a crucial role in providing information to parents about vaccines. Okay? So one of the things we have to figure out is, how can we help them be more effective? Okay? That turns out to be a very hard question to study scientifically. Okay? But I think we should be thinking more carefully about how we promote vaccination, again, rather than just assuming that throwing facts and evidence at people will work. Okay, so I want to wrap up so we have some time for questions. Let me just say the 3 points I hope you'll take away from this are, first, there are deep-seated psychological reasons we believe things that aren't true. Second, giving people facts and evidence can sometimes make those misperceptions worse rather than better. And we should be very cautious about just assuming that information will have the intended effect, because sometimes it can make the problem worse. So let me stop there and take your questions. Thanks. I think we have microphones, so I'll defer to whoever's nearby.
Hi. You referred many times to political knowledge And I wondered kind of how that was defined for you, because it certainly seems to be very different from scientific knowledge. I understand that the level of scientific knowledge in Congress, for instance, is extremely low, maybe even compared to the general population, but I may be wrong. Thanks.
Okay, good question. So depending on what area you're in, the kind of knowledge that might matter could differ. So the political knowledge measures that I was referring you to were those kinds of trivia style questions I described to you earlier, like what percentage of votes are required to override a veto? Okay. We've used those for a long time in politics. They're a good measure of domain knowledge for politics. They wouldn't apply everywhere. They're different sorts of measures you can use, for sure. They're going to tend to be correlated, of course, between domains, though. Other questions, please? Oh, sorry. Hi.
I've got two questions for you. There have been a number of studies in recent years that show this bias that correction tends to reinforce misperceptions. And correction, and particularly fact-checking political ads, have become very popular in journalism. And yet it seems that opens a tremendous risk, especially when in politics especially, there's a giant industry, very well-funded industry that's very advanced and well-situated to exploit misconfirmation bias there. So the first question is, do you think that this dynamic of human perception presents a danger to democracy? And the second question is, what can we do about it? How can you communicate a message that where truth doesn't reinforce error?
Okay, great questions. All right, let me answer both of those. So the first point, so fact-checking has become much more common in politics in particular. So does that work? The evidence I've presented suggests we should be skeptical about persuading people on these deep-seated misperceptions. But let me give you some different evidence from some other research I haven't shown you, which suggests that fact-checking can help constrain politicians from making those claims in the first place. Okay? So I think it's important to think about the role of elites and how holding them accountable for making the misleading claims that help create these misperceptions might be effective, even if once those misperceptions reach critical mass, they're very difficult to counter. Okay? So in terms of the strength of democracy and how we can make things better, I think what we need to think about is not trying to change the fundamentals of human psychology, right, which is not likely to happen anytime soon, but instead how we can make our institutions work better and hold our elites accountable. Okay? So I think of people here as the victims, not the perpetrators. Okay? They're being let down by a political system that isn't giving them the tools they need to make good decisions. In fact, is actively misleading them in some cases. Okay? And the more we can hold politicians accountable for making these claims, hopefully the less likely people will be to believe them. Oh, yeah, please.
So we live in an information age, and over the last 30 years, say, we've had an explosion of things like the internet and cable news. And just thinking about that, we have so much more information at our fingertips, but we also have so much more misinformation at our fingertips. And the misinformation seems to always be so impassioned, and the information seems to be like your CDC slide, which is very dry. So have you, or do you know of people who've looked at this sort of data from 1975 versus now? And are we better or worse off in the information age with these misperceptions than we used to be?
That's a great question. Let me say two things about it. The first is scientifically, we don't know whether we're more or less misinformed. The first problem is people didn't study misperceptions very often in surveys, as far as I can tell, before, when our politics were less polarized. I think they were less salient. Doesn't mean people were any less misinformed. And the second problem is it's hard to make comparisons. Right? So if 40% of people believe in this misperception in 1975 and 50% of people believe in this misperception in 1994, is the 50% worse than the 40%, or is this one so much worse than this one that we can't decide, right? So that's hard to arbitrate. But let me speak to the broader point about the information age, which I think is a question people often have. So is it the case that people can pull in whatever information they want to confirm their pre-existing views? The answer is yes, in principle. In practice, most of us don't exert the effort required to really fully insulate ourselves in information cocoons. Now, our technology are getting better at that, right? So it may be the case that changes. Okay? But the best evidence we have, people who've done things like get data on what websites people actually look at, as well as what sorts of media they're exposed to, including the cable news you walk by in the coffee shop and the airport and all those things, suggests that people's information diets in general are much more balanced than we feared would happen. Okay? People are exposed to broad arrays of information. Now, it may be the case that certain subsets of the population are more cocooned, who might matter more, like, say, political activists and donors, for instance. But in general, the evidence actually on that is weaker than a lot of people feared. Okay, so I don't think that's driving this, and I think it's important to be cautious about waiting for the evidence on it. I do fear it could contribute, though, and certainly something like social media, you can obviously imagine how that could help disseminate these things in a way that wasn't even as much of a factor, say, in 2009. All right.
So I was questioning those graphs that you'd had on there earlier, and
Sure.
I'm wondering how you draw the line between an uninformed person who has revised and recorrected their lack of knowledge and someone who is, I hate to say it, but like gullible and has just chosen to latch on to whatever next piece of information they've gotten. As compared to the people on the other side who might be well-informed and well-educated enough to try to hold fast to a belief that might not be popular, but in the long run could actually choose to end up being the correct one. How do you make that distinction between like false confidence that could eventually prove to be true versus people that just believe everything they're told?
That's a good question. I don't know how to define gullibility scientifically. That's an interesting question. I would want to think about that more. We can ask people to rate, for instance, how subjectively confident they are in their beliefs, like I showed you in one of those slides. But the more general kind of tendency for people to hold fixed to their views, you can ask people to self-report that. I could ask you, you agree or disagree? Do you ever change your mind, right? And you say, I disagree. I never change my mind, right? We can ask you questions like that. Those haven't proven to be very fruitful so far. You may answer that in an aspirational way of the kind of person you'd like to be, right? We all think we're dispassionate and even-handed, right? So it's tricky. Yeah, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, I pointed to. Sorry, he's got a microphone. We'll go to you next. Okay.
Let me first say, you talked about there was a high relation of belief in doctors about vaccines. I'm old enough to be of the age when the first polio vaccine, and polio was a horrible threat, the Salk vaccine came out, and I remember my father taking me to the doctor and asking the question about the effectiveness of the vaccine, and the doctor's answer was, I gave it to my daughter. And my father turned and said, roll up your sleeve. My comment, I'm retired, but I'm a former teacher. And one of the things I taught in social studies was what we called government or civics. And I sense, and I'd be interested to know if there's been any studies done, that the teaching of those subjects has greatly declined, whether it's because of teaching to test or everybody's too busy or whatever. But those have, so a large part of the population, as compared to back then, doesn't have the basic knowledge of how our government is supposed to work. And the other thing I'm wondering is, has there been any studies done on the teaching or understanding of critical thinking? Because it seems to me I see an awful lot of people out working against their own self-interest because there's been some sort of a razzle-dazzle, whatever approach might be taken. So can you speak about the teaching, basic understanding throughout the society of government and civics and critical thinking?
Sure. I really like the first point, though, about I gave it to my daughter, and I just was talking with a pediatrician about this who said he frequently brings up his decision to vaccinate his own children. Because one of the key questions parents ask doctors is, would you do this if this were your child, okay? Or if this was your family member, okay? So I really think there's something to that as a signal of doctors' belief. This isn't just cheap talk, I'm really practicing it. As far as education, I'm going to push back at you a little bit about that one. I'm reluctant. And the reason is, so if you look at the history of American education, there's this repeated pattern of people declaring crises and the education system has failed. About every 5 or 10 years we have one of these. And there's a similar kind of pattern about civic knowledge. Okay? Most of the survey evidence says people didn't know that much about politics at any of these points. I'm not sure that I can see evidence in objective measures that people know less. And the second reason I'm hesitant about that is because, for reasons I was sort of alluding to, but I want to make a little more precise, when people know more about politics and are more engaged with it, they're more likely to be polarized. They're better able to align their beliefs in consistent ways. And what that may entail, though not always, is aligning their factual beliefs with their political views. So those folks who are more politically sophisticated are going to tend to be more polarized, and they may be better able to line up those factual beliefs with those political views they hold. So I'm not sure. I'm all for civic education. I think it's great. I teach American government here, and I hope all of you send your children here and I can teach it to them. But I'm not sure it's going to make. I'm not sure, because in some cases, having strong political views cuts in the other direction. Okay, and the critical thinking. Agreeing on what critical thinking means is we could have a whole seminar just on that. So let me just say that's a tough one to make tractable, and maybe we can talk about it afterwards. I want to jump to this gentleman in the front, if you don't mind handing me that microphone.
Oh, I got a mic.
Oh, you got it. Oh, good.
So, so you're a political scientist, so I can understand why you think that people's political views color their perceptions of these risks a lot. But as a doctor, I see that there's really not much sway that we can have in people's behaviors as you might think we have in people's behaviors. And a lot of it comes down to their risk perception, that people, perhaps Democrats and Republicans, view risks differently. And one generalization I would say is that people will often augment the risk of something that's dramatic and rare, much greater than something that's common but blasé. How do we in society change people's risk perceptions so that they'll behave more appropriately?
Yeah, that's a really tough, that's a very important point and a really difficult problem, okay? One example of that we're living through right now is Ebola. There was an article today saying you are actually at greater risk of your furniture falling on you and killing you than being killed by Ebola. Okay, when you go home, watch out for your couch, okay? But that fear of those dramatic but rare events is pervasive, right? It's why we fear flying and dying in a plane crash much more than we do driving to the airport, even though driving to the airport is much more dangerous, okay? I don't know how to overcome that, and I know it's really challenging for doctors because when I say this to them, they say, think about how much I have to accomplish in a 15-minute visit. Right, I'm a pediatrician. I have a 15-minute well-child visit. I have a whole series of things I have to cover with this family. Okay, now I have to change their risk perceptions and their views of vaccines in addition to everything else. That's really tough. Okay, so it's gonna take some careful thinking about how to do that. And one of the things that we talked about, I've been talking with different people in health, is how can you think about this further upstream in the health system, right? When people are first delivering and thinking about, or even when they're pregnant, right? That's when they're starting to think about vaccines. As a parent, as a new parent, that's one of those issues you've never thought about before, and you may be starting to think about for the first time. By the time you get in for that first appointment, that person may have already formed their views, and as we've seen, once people form those views, they're tough to change. And asking that doctor to change them is going to be hard. The risk perception point, I'm with you on too, and that's a very difficult problem. All right, yes, please.
You talked about changing the perceptions. I don't know if you use prudent man or reasonable man, but you're going, this is a reasonable risk to take. But I walk into my doctor and I am as smart as you, so I know that I'm going to give my child a vaccination. And before I get the vaccination, as you say, this requires careful thinking. The people who have done some very careful thinking now require me to read some legal gobbledygook and sign something. And my husband's a lawyer. He doesn't allow me to sign anything. Anything. I'm sorry, but the message I'm getting, sent by people who have thought this through very carefully, is that, no, this isn't a safe thing, and I must be knowledgeable. And you say that you have given people factual information and correction. Well, so has my doctor. And my doctor's factual information contradicts yours. Absolutely. It says this is such a serious risk, I must have a signature from you. So you,
So it's a-
when
it's
you
a-
say that you're correcting people's information, you're presenting what you consider to be a fact, but perhaps nobody else on the
Well,
planet
okay,
considers to be a fact.
let me say this. So what you should think about here is, that we've tried very hard as a society to think what it means for people to give informed consent. And so what that means is when you go through certain medical procedures, they say, this is everything that could possibly happen to you. Okay?
This is a vaccination. This isn't surgery.
Yes, but there's a certain very small but non-zero risk that's very well estimated and studied of certain kinds of adverse events associated with vaccines. They are very, very rare. People overestimate them dramatically because of this risk perception bias. Okay, they do happen though. Okay, and we want people to be able to give informed consent, and therefore they're asked often to say, "I understand that these are events that could happen." Why? Well, we live in a very litigious society, and people often afterwards are filing lawsuits. Okay, but there are all sorts of risks that are far more common and threatening in everyday life. Again, how many of you drove here? Okay, that is probably the most dangerous thing you do. Okay, if you had to sign something in your car saying like I could be subject to death and dismemberment every time, right? Think about what that disclosure would look like if you had to sign a disclosure every time you drove. Okay, 40,000+ people or something die in car accidents every year. Okay, it's a very dangerous activity. Okay, so I don't think those lists of every event that could happen associated with those disprove my point. I'm very confident in the science behind the autism myth not being real. Okay, we can talk about the various sorts of adverse events. We have a very extensive reporting system in this country that tracks these things and can document just how rare they are. They're non-zero, but they're very rare. And that's true of every medical procedure. Okay?
Does that answer my point?
I believe it does, but I think we're almost out of time.
So yeah, so it's 5 o'clock, so we have time for just 2 more questions. So we had one here.
Okay, in the back, please.
Thank you. This may be repetitive of an earlier question. Do you consider it desirable or worthwhile to attempt to hold people accountable or responsible for the actions or behaviors they perform based upon their tenaciously held misconceptions or misinformation? And if so, how would society go about that?
Can you give an example of what you mean? I'm not sure I understand the question.
For example, if sufficient number of parents did not vaccinate their children within a given community, and there were an outbreak of a disease, I don't know, measles or some other condition that, as you say, could have been prevented by sufficient level of vaccination, and there were an epidemic and a number of children died or were seriously injured for, I don't know, life or impaired, could that be considered socially antisocial behavior and worthy of an attempt to prevent?
Yeah, okay. So that's a very tricky issue. I would say we'd have to think very carefully about that. People have religious objections to vaccines that we've tried very carefully to honor. The thing I would say is I'm hesitant to talk about that direct sort of accountability. Some places are starting to rethink their exemption policies for vaccines, and there may be ways to appropriately strike that balance that maintain scope for instance, religious objections, while at least making it in some cases it's easier to exempt from vaccines than to document that you've had them. Okay, so we've actually reversed what should be the appropriate burden there, right? And so there may be ways to adjust that balance more appropriately. But I don't want to go too far on that. I think that's a tricky philosophical issue. We have time for one last question.
Thank you. With respect to those who may not believe the corrective information, as you put it, if you assume for the sake of discussion that the disseminators of this corrective information are government agencies, and that the government agencies have themselves been politicized over time increasingly, and that the media members that are also disseminating this information have also been politicized over time, and that even the fact checkers are being supported by political action groups like MoveOn.org, Fact Check, or others on the other side, is it not rational for a thinking person to be critically examining what is put forth as a correct or a correction?
No, that's a good question. So let me say two things. First, of course you should examine it critically. I would never say you shouldn't examine it critically. But I think what your question points us to is the challenge of this, which is in a deeply politicized society with a high degree of polarization, it's very hard to think of authorities or institutions that everyone trusts or everyone would listen to. Okay? So what I've suggested to many people, and you may or may not find this persuasive, but I think it's one approach, is to point out in many cases how strong this consensus is. So let's say, for the sake of argument, someone's a Republican, right? To point out that unemployment conspiracy theory I described to you was immediately denounced by Republican economists and former administration officials. Okay? When the death panel came out, there was an excellent ABC News story that said Republican and Democratic healthcare experts and doctors all agree that this isn't true. Okay? So it's the consensus across partisan lines that I hope is the most persuasive, but that is a real challenge. Okay? And I think we have to stop it there. So thank you guys very much for coming out.
Yeah, we just want to thank Professor Nyhan for the really engaging discussion today, and thank you all for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.